problem I have with Christianity is, why does God send people to hell, like to this eternal damnation, simply for not believing in something that's pretty understandable to not believe in?
How is that understandable?
I'm simply unconvinced by the evidence that I have seen, I guess.
Okay, good. Okay, now just notice what you said. I am unconvinced by the information, the evidence that I've seen so far. I'm unconvinced that God exists, that Jesus is the truth. So what's the more convincing option? And what's the evidence that supports the more convincing option?
I get it. What are you trying to ask? Like,
All right.
The more convincing option is that there is no God, I guess. Just that's kind of my default. That's what I look out and see, I guess.
You're not here by default. You're not as well put together. And come on, sir, you are well put together. Let's be honest. You're not so well put together by default, by chaos, by, I don't believe anything. I just landed here at OSU. Freak accident. I'm a student here. Sure, you're lying to yourself if you believe that, and you're lying to me. You know very well that you're not here by default. You're here because you studied and worked. You have ambition. You have goals. You're here for a reason. In other words, sorry, sir, you are living for something. I don't know what it is, but remember, you started this with lack of evidence. I'm unconvinced. No problem. But you see, when you say lack of evidence, what you're saying is, before I can believe something, I have to have this amount of evidence. And because this amount of evidence, whatever this is not met by God, is not met by Christ, I can't believe. So please tell me, what's the option that's more convincing?
I'm kind of more agnostic, leaning towards, I don't want to say theism because that implies like there's something directly that I believe, but yeah, there is a lot of evidence of some sort of like creator or intelligent design.
Okay.
I'm more agnostic, leaning towards atheist when it comes to Christianity specifically, which is kind of why I brought up like heaven and hell, or hell, because that's kind of more like what I have a problem with.
Okay, so are you a theist? Do you believe some type of God exists?
It's possible, yeah. I can't say that for sure, but like I would lean towards that, honestly, yeah.
You can be agnostic when it comes to, is Coke better than Pepsi? You can say, I'm agnostic, I don't know, I honestly don't care. You cannot be agnostic when it comes to God, because the God issue is tied to human value, purpose and meaning in life, ethics, and life after death. And like it or not, you have to answer the question, can I step on the cockroach, but not on her? It's an ethical decision. Like it or not, you have to choose, I'm going to cheat the IRS, or I'm going to pay my taxes. You have to live ethically. You embrace some ethical code. You have to answer the question, is she valuable or not? And if so, why? You have to answer the question, what is the purpose of my life? Because obviously, you just look at your ambition. You obviously have decided there's some purpose, and you're ambitious to fulfill that purpose, right? And then like it or not, you're going to have to go to grandma and grandpa's funeral. You're going to have to go to mom and dad's funeral one day, and you can't tell me that you're going to sit there in a pew or wherever you're sitting and saying, doesn't matter, I don't know, I really don't care. Am I going to see grandma and grandpa ever again? Am I going to see mom and dad ever again or not? You see, you can't be agnostic. You just can't say, well, I don't know, because you have to.
In the dialogue above, the two speakers present the argument that the question of Jesus' reliability precedes moral disagreement with Christian doctrine, and I observe that this framing clarifies the debate, but also exposes its most demanding implication. The questioner identifies happiness as his highest value and is refreshingly honest about it. This admission matters because it confirms the respondent's earlier claim. Everyone orients life around something ultimate. The disagreement is not about whether worship exists, but about whether one is a trustworthy object of it. The respondent reframes the issue as a question of epistemic authority. Am I the best judge of what will ultimately satisfy me, or might the Creator know better? The discussion then narrows to Jesus' historicity. Both sides accept that Jesus existed based on historical sources. At this point, the debate becomes sharper. If Jesus is historically real, ethically profound, and claimed divine authority, then neutrality becomes harder to maintain. The respondent presses this fork in the road effectively. Jesus is either reliable or deceptive. Admiration without commitment becomes unstable. The questioner's resistance crystallizes around hell and non-resistant non-belief. This is a philosophically serious objection, not a moral tantrum. The intuition behind it is simple. It seems unjust for a good God to condemn sincere unbelief. The respondent answers not by softening the doctrine, but by reframing the human condition. Hell is not introduced as punishment for ignorance, but as the consequence of moral separation, of real wrongdoing, before a morally perfect God. Grace in this account is not entitlement but rescue. This response is internally coherent within Christian theology, but it demands something heavy from the listener, humility rather than mere assent. The respondent is essentially saying that the barrier is not intellectual doubt alone, but moral self-assessment. That move is persuasive to some and alienating to others because it shifts the debate from external evidence to internal posture. The final exchange sharpens the cost of discipleship. Once Jesus is trusted as reliable, disagreement with his teachings no longer functions as veto power. The believer must decide whether personal moral intuition outranks divine authority. This is the real threshold. Christianity does not merely ask to be examined, it asks to be obeyed. For the questioner, that demand feels premature. For the respondent, postponing it means the evidence has not yet been taken seriously enough. We now continue with the debate, discussion.
I'm still not prescribing myself to like a certain way of living per se. Christianity would be that, but that's something that I am unconvinced of. And
Okay.
yeah, I mean, I personally, when you say, like, when you said before everyone has like something they worship, I guess for me it would be like happiness. I'm just trying to find happiness however I can.
Good. Am I a better source of determining where happiness comes from? Or is the God who created me and revealed himself in Jesus Christ as being the most joyful being in the universe a more reliable source of informing me where happiness is found? So then the question becomes, do you think Jesus existed?
Yeah.
Why?
The historical evidence, I guess.
Good. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four Gospels. And in that historical record, we read that Jesus lived an amazing life, taught mind-boggling ethical teachings, died a sacrificial death, loving his enemies, and then rose from the dead. Do you think the evidence is he's reliable? Or do you think the evidence is he's a charlatan, a hypocrite?
But regardless of whether, like, I'm convinced of those things, there's still things that come with Christianity that I have to accept that I'm not super sure about, which is why I brought up the hell thing. I don't see how a God who is all good and all fair can send someone to hell for, simply being unconvinced of his existence. The concept of non-resistant non-belief.
God, you are so privileged to take me to heaven. No, it begins with an attitude of humility where I say, you know something, I'm in touch with my life. At times I've done good, at other times I've done evil. And because I've done evil, and because God doesn't have a trace of evil in his character, I'm in trouble. I have separated myself from God, and therefore I need his grace, his forgiveness, because I am spiritually poor. And that's what begins the process of getting closer to God and going to heaven when I trust Christ, that he died on the cross to pay the penalty for my wrongdoing. In other words, he does something for me that I cannot do. I am poor in spirit. I realize I need him.
That, yeah, you do want to trust him and obey him. Again, that puts you into, okay, you're now a Christian, and there's all these other, you read the Bible, there's all these other things in there. You're like, okay, there's things in here. Okay, I don't really agree with that. That's maybe a contradiction.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I wasn't right to follow and try to trust Jesus or whatever.
Okay, well then it becomes a simple issue of this. Am I a better source of defining good and evil? Or is God? God's all-loving, Jesus revealed. God's all-knowing. Am I really convinced that I am a better source of defining good and evil than God is? So, my point is, but if you're going to get inside Christ's framework, what he's saying is, God is all-knowing, God is all-loving, therefore God knows better than you do. So don't worry. You first have to ascertain, does the evidence point to Jesus being reliable or not? And if you conclude the evidence of his life, teachings, death, and resurrection is he is reliable, then you got to trust him, if you're intellectually honest. You got to put your faith in him, and then you understand. Although I might disagree with him about some ethical issue, because he's all-knowing and all-loving, it's wise to obey him. Because that's the question you were asking. You were asking, if I put my faith in Christ, but I bump into a teaching of his that I disagree with, what do I do then? The answer to your question is, what you do then, if you've already examined the evidence that he's reliable, you've already put your faith and trust in him, but you bump into a teaching of his that you disagree with, well, then you got to ask yourself, is my heart a better measure of good and evil, or is an all-knowing, all-loving God a better one to determine and define what is good and what is evil?
Well, do I trust him? You say, okay, yeah, I agree with these things that he says. And then if later down the line you disagree, then that kind of brings you back to where you were at the start, and maybe like...
You meet a guy who taught like Jesus taught, who lived like Jesus lived, who died like Jesus died, and who rose from the dead like Jesus rose from the dead. I think the overwhelming evidence is you want to trust that dude. He's reliable. That's how you come to faith. Then, you're no different from me. You put your faith in Christ.
In the dialogue above, the two speakers present the argument that obedience to Christ logically follows from his reliability, and I observe that this is the most internally consistent, yet also the most demanding claim made so far. The respondent carefully constructs a conditional framework. Christianity, as he presents it, does not begin with blind obedience. It begins with investigation. Only after examining the evidence of Jesus' life, teachings, death, and resurrection does authority come into play. This sequencing matters. If Jesus is not reliable, obedience is irrational. But if he is reliable, then selective obedience becomes incoherent. This is where the conversation reaches its sharpest logical edge. The respondent forces the questioner to confront an uncomfortable implication. Disagreement with Jesus' teachings is no longer merely an intellectual disagreement, it becomes a challenge to authority. The issue is not whether moral intuitions exist, but whether those intuitions outrank a being claimed to be all-knowing and all-loving. Within the Christian framework, continued resistance is not neutral. It is a decision to retain moral sovereignty. At the same time, this argument carries a heavy presupposition that the evidence for Jesus' reliability is sufficiently strong to justify such sweeping authority. The respondent asserts this confidence, but the questioner has not yet granted it. As long as that evidential gap remains, the call to obedience can feel premature, even coercive. The structure is sound, but its persuasive power depends entirely on whether the listener agrees that the resurrection actually occurred. The respondent's final illustration, if you met someone who lived, taught, died, and rose like Jesus, is rhetorically effective. It personalizes the abstract logic. Trust, in this sense, is not blind submission but relational confidence. Yet for a skeptic, the resurrection remains the hinge point. Without it, the argument collapses back into moral philosophy. With it, the argument becomes existentially unavoidable. This segment clarifies the true nature of the debate. Christianity is not offering better advice. It is claiming rightful authority. Accepting that authority requires more than admiration. It requires surrender. Whether that surrender is rational or unwarranted depends entirely on the historical claim that still hangs unresolved. We now continue with the debate discussion.
But what you begin to realize is, oopsie-daisy, when it comes to sex, I disagree with Jesus. When it comes to money, oopsie-daisy, I disagree with Jesus. I don't want to be generous. I want 2 houses, not just 1. I want 4 cars, and I would like a Tesla and a Mercedes also. And you begin to realize, uh-oh, Jesus says, no, you don't live that way. Instead, you consider giving money away to feed the hungry. Oh my goodness, that makes me very uncomfortable. But then you've got to start asking yourself, wait a second, is the all-knowing God, who's all-loving, a more reliable source of information about good and evil than my heart? That's a no-brainer. My heart is one twisted thing. I'm a twisted dude. At times I do good, at times I do evil. So I'm going to trust Christ even though I disagree with him, and I do at times. That's why I sin, I rebel, I don't agree with him, I don't submit to him. But I ask him for forgiveness, and I keep going with him.
Yeah, so before you had asked me, it's like, do you think Christ is reliable? And I haven't looked super deep into the historicity of the Bible and Jesus,
Right.
but based on what I've seen,
Right.
yeah, he seemed like a great dude. He did great things. That's not me acknowledging that he is God and he's all-knowing and all-loving.
No.
But that's what you have to presuppose to then, when you disagree with him, just say, oh, I must be wrong. Like, I must have just...
Well, no, what you do is you examine his lifestyle, his teachings, his death, and his resurrection, and you decide, does the evidence point to his credibility, his trustworthiness, or does it not? And if the evidence is that he's trustworthy, you take a step of faith, you trust in him, you begin building a relationship, a spiritual relationship with him. You experience his trustworthiness now in your life, and then boom, you hit the wall, like I hit the wall, like most of us hit the wall, and say, oh, we got a disagreement here. Mm-hmm. But then you ask yourself, am I more reliable as a source of information about good and evil than the God who loves me, who created me, and who's all-knowing?
In the dialogue above, the 2 speakers present the argument that genuine Christian faith inevitably clashes with personal desire and moral autonomy, and I observe that this exchange exposes the true psychological cost of belief far more clearly than any abstract doctrine. The respondent is unusually candid about the internal conflict of discipleship. He does not portray obedience as natural or comfortable. Instead, he frames it as a repeated confrontation between desire and authority. Sex, money, status, generosity. This honesty strengthens his case. It avoids the illusion that faith produces moral ease. Christianity, as presented here, is not about feeling righteous. It is about admitting moral fracture and choosing trust over instinct. The questioner responds with a crucial clarification. Admiring Jesus does not equal acknowledging his divinity. This distinction matters deeply. Many people are willing to call Jesus a great teacher precisely because that label allows selective agreement without surrender. The questioner is resisting what philosophers call total authority claims, claims that override one's independent moral judgment. The respondent answers by tightening the logic. Authority is not presupposed, it is inferred. The evidence must first justify trustworthiness. Only then does obedience follow. This is a coherent structure, but it places enormous weight on the historical resurrection. Without that event, Jesus remains an impressive moral figure among others. With it, he becomes categorically different. The tension here is not intellectual laziness. It is existential risk. To grant Jesus divine authority is to risk being wrong about oneself. The questioner senses this and resists. The respondent embraces it and names it. The heart is not a neutral compass. That claim is philosophically controversial, but psychologically resonant. Many ethical failures arise not from ignorance, but from rationalized desire. This segment reveals the real divide. The questioner wants evidence sufficient to justify surrender. The respondent believes the evidence already warrants it. Until that evidential disagreement is resolved, the debate cannot conclude. What remains is not hostility, but hesitation. A hesitation rooted in the fear of yielding moral control. We now continue with the debate discussion.
I can say that, yeah, he seemed like a good dude, but I can't say, like, for sure that he was, in fact, God and all-knowing and all-powerful, and that's something that I feel like you have to presuppose before you just give him authority, like, to everything, and, like, I no longer know what's good for me, you know?
Well, I would push back against he was a good dude. He was saying things like, unless you hate your father and mother, you can't be my disciple. Doesn't sound like a very good dude to me. How about the chords that he used on the money changers in John chapter 2? Flipped over tables. Sounds like a pretty angry dude. But then most of all, he said, worship me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Worship me? Sounds like an egomaniacal dictator. He claimed that you cannot live a selfish life. He claimed that you have to forgive even your enemy. And I don't think you think he's as cool of a dude as you are saying right now. And if you do, if you are being honest with me, then you're right, you haven't read much about his life. And I would ask you to please read about his life.
Yeah. Okay.
So don't come to him just because you think he's a cool dude, because nobody was coming to him when he was alive because they thought he was a cool dude. They either wanted to stone him, hang him on a cross, or they wanted to worship him as God. There was nobody who was like vanilla and in this neutral space of, hey, he's kind of cool. Let's hang out with him. Right? There's no hippie movement going on at the time saying, hey, Jesus freak, let's just smoke weed and hang with Jesus. So what makes him God is ultimately the historicity, the evidence behind the resurrection. Did that occur or not? And so if you believe that it occurred, well, then you got to worship him as Lord. If it didn't occur, then he was just a charlatan, amongst many other crazy charlatans that you should say, no, let's discard. Now, sure, you can take some of the Judeo-Christian values, but that still came from a crazy, egomaniacal charlatan. So be careful in taking those from him. And how would the top ethical teachings were simply footnotes, like Robert Coles said at Harvard, to the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, everybody looks at the Sermon on the Mount quite literally as the top ethical teachings ever.
In the dialogue above, the two speakers present the argument that Jesus cannot be safely categorized as merely a good moral teacher. And I observe that this is the most logically clarifying yet also polarizing moment of the entire conversation. The respondent deliberately dismantles the sentimental version of Jesus by citing hard sayings, confrontational actions, and explicit claims to divine authority. He blocks a common escape route, admiration without allegiance. If these claims are taken seriously, Jesus does not fit comfortably into the category of a gentle moral philosopher. His demands are absolute, disruptive, and socially destabilizing. This line of reasoning is often summarized as the liar, lunatic, or Lord dilemma. Its strength lies in narrowing the options. It challenges the listener to decide whether Jesus' self-understanding was delusional, deceptive, or truthful. The respondent is right to insist that neutrality is historically implausible. The recorded reactions to Jesus, worship, outrage, execution, support the claim that he was perceived as a threat, not a curiosity. However, the argument also has a vulnerability. It assumes that the gospel accounts preserve Jesus' words and intentions with sufficient accuracy to justify the dilemma. A skeptic might argue that legendary development, theological editing, or later interpretation could inflate Jesus' self-claims. If that possibility is not addressed, the dilemma risks becoming a false trilemma, forcing a choice while excluding alternative explanations. Still, the respondent's central point remains forceful. One cannot selectively extract ethical teachings while discarding the authority claims without intellectual tension. If Jesus is dismissed as an egomaniac, then borrowing his moral vision becomes inconsistent. If he is embraced as a moral authority, then his identity claims must be faced head-on. This segment crystallizes the debate into a single hinge question. Did the resurrection occur? Everything else, ethics, authority, worship, flows from that historical claim. The conversation has now reached its logical climax. What remains is not argument escalation, but decision. We now continue with the debate, discussion.
But you have this crazy charlatan as the one who talked about them, who claimed worship, who said you're a dirty, rotten sinner. Man, he said some bad things. That's why people, in order to come to Christ, you have to be offended by him first. I'm offended by Jesus. I hope I don't just go to the cross and say, oh, how loving, how forgiving. No, he says you're a dirty, rotten sinner. That should offend you to some extent. And so the idea of a God contradicting and then affirming every culture that's ever existed in the last 2,000 years
In the dialogue above, the two speakers present the argument that Jesus' moral brilliance cannot be separated from his offense, and I observe that this final exchange resolves the debate by exposing the unavoidable confrontation at the heart of Christianity. The respondent closes by acknowledging something often ignored in popular portrayals of Jesus. His teachings are not merely inspiring, they are accusatory. The Sermon on the Mount is admired precisely because it exposes moral failure at a deeper level than external behavior. Jesus does not flatter human psychology, he indicts it. This is why offense is not an accident of Christianity, but a prerequisite to it. The respondent's appeal to psychology and culture is noteworthy. A God who both affirms human dignity and exposes human brokenness avoids the extremes of naive optimism and nihilistic despair. This dual claim resonates across cultures because it matches lived experience. People are capable of profound good and devastating harm. Christianity's diagnosis is uncomfortable, but it is coherent. The argument then returns one final time to its central hinge, the resurrection. Ethical insight alone does not make Jesus divine. Psychological depth alone does not grant authority. What transforms Jesus from teacher to Lord is the claim that death itself was defeated. If that claim is false, Christianity collapses. If it is true, resistance becomes existential rather than intellectual. The closing invitation does not attempt to win the argument by force. It shifts from debate to relationship, from persuasion to encounter. The respondent implicitly acknowledges that no amount of argument can replace personal investigation. The conversation ends not with certainty imposed, but with a door left open. In the dialogue above, the two speakers present a sustained examination of Christianity that gradually shifts from historical questions to moral authority, and I observe that the real divide between them is not evidence versus ignorance, but control versus trust. Throughout the conversation, the skeptic repeatedly signals openness. He acknowledges the historical existence of Jesus, the moral power of his teachings, and even the plausibility of some form of transcendent reality. His resistance does not come from dismissal, but from caution. He is unwilling to grant ultimate authority to a figure whose claims would require surrendering his independent moral judgment, especially on emotionally charged doctrines like hell. The Christian respondent, however, reframes the entire discussion by challenging the assumption that moral autonomy is neutral or reliable. He argues that human intuition is already compromised by desire, bias, and self-interest. From this perspective, the demand of Christianity is not merely to believe certain facts, but to recognize the limits of the self as a moral authority. Faith, then, is not intellectual laziness. It is a calculated act of trust, grounded in perceived reliability. What makes the exchange intellectually serious is that neither side argues superficially. The skeptic does not caricature faith as irrational, and the believer does not reduce doubt to rebellion alone. Instead, the debate exposes a deeper philosophical tension, whether ultimate meaning and moral truth can be grounded without appealing to an authority beyond the self. The resurrection emerges as the decisive fulcrum because it functions as a legitimacy test. Without it, Jesus' ethical brilliance can be admired but safely relativized. With it, neutrality collapses. The conversation, therefore, does not fail due to lack of clarity. It ends precisely because clarity has been achieved. The remaining barrier is not information, but willingness. In the end, the dialogue demonstrates that Christianity is not primarily an argument to be won, but a claim to be confronted. It does not merely invite agreement, it demands a decision, either to retain moral sovereignty or to entrust it to a figure claimed to have conquered death itself.